I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and know that sovereignty has never been ceded. I am grateful that Naarm has been a place for us to gather from all over the world, and a place that I will hold in my heart as one of inspiration. I would like to welcome to the closing ceremony His Excellency, former President of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, and Her Excellency, Mrs. Gugu Motlanthe. Honourable Gabrielle Williams, Minister for Mental Health, Minister for Ambulance Services, and Minister for Treaty and First Peoples. Paul Hunt, Chief Human Rights Commissioner of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Judy Chang, the Executive Director of the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, and all of our delegates. So it feels quite incredible to have shared this time together over the past few days. At HRI, we are truly honoured that so many people have taken up our offer of a space to gather. It is a very, very special thing to see so many old friends in this unique space, which can only be created when this many people come together with intent. Feels a little bit like I'm stating the obvious, but it has been truly extraordinary. I don't like to state the obvious. I find it a little bit awkward. I think it's best to assume that people you are talking to are a few steps ahead of you. When I was a teenager, my mother sat me down. She said, "Naomi, you are such a bright child, top of your class in 3rd grade. But it's best to assume those days are behind us." So I try not to state the obvious. This week I haven't felt so awkward. The conference directors gave me a few jobs to do, so that was useful. But I think it's more about the fact we are in a space where I hope it is clear that everybody can bring their full self. Young, old, straight, queer, trans. We have created a space that is not ableist, that is not misogynist, and that is actively anti-racist. Strength and solidarity. Strength and solidarity only works if it's solidarity that's truly inclusive. For me, one of the most special aspects of the conference is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, Maori people, and Indigenous people from all over the world accepted the offer that we extended to gather here, to speak and to generously share their expertise. I feel like their voices have shaped this conference into something way more than we could possibly have imagined, so please join me in thanking the Indigenous people of this conference. I also just want to briefly mention that by virtue of our incredible awards ceremony and how much we're all moved on Sunday, we spoke of the crisis in Ukraine. But obviously, there's not just one part of the world that's in crisis at any given point in time. We are privileged to have a number of delegates from Myanmar here this week who have been under persecution of the military coup. The human rights defenders from the Philippines have had a fight on their hand for the past decade. Lists are exclusive, but the LGBT population of Uganda that's under threat, the fact that Sudan has been under Khartoum and cities all over the country of Sudan have been bombed all week, the fact that Lebanon is in this ongoing crisis where they just can't get out. So please, all of our delegates, we see you and we stand with you. So, it is my very great pleasure to invite to the microphone Mr. Kgalema Motlanthe, the former President and former Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa. including former Deputy President of the African National Congress, the ANC. He's currently the chairperson of the Oliver Reginald Tambo School of Leadership and also the chairperson of the African National Congress Electoral Committee that oversees ANC's provincial and national leadership elections, including the election of the current South African president for a second term, and other leaders who have now ascended into national government and the National Assembly in South Africa. I think, if our closing ceremony is to help us to look into the future as a boost to go home with, I can't think of a better leader to set that vision than President Motlanthe.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for your warm words of welcome. Let me also recognize and greet my fellow panelists, Gabrielle Williams, Paul Hunt, and Judy Chang. And good afternoon to all of you. But first off, I would like to thank Harm Reduction International for providing this dynamic forum to share the latest research and discussions on practices in drug use, harm reduction, and human rights, especially at a time when the voices of the people most affected by drug policies around the world are in desperate need for not only policy reform, but a pathway that navigates communities to realizing shared long-term value within a system that upholds compassionate and sustainable outcomes and replaces harmful practices with human-centered, science-based development. By mending our political, economic, and social approaches and building a language and understanding of holistic concern, we can create a standard for the entire world. Over the last few days, we have learned so much from each other, confirming that there is strength in solidarity. As people, as a community, and as a global movement, we can rally and unify social forces and ensure that the paradigm does shift with regard to drug policy. Year on year, this conference attracts diverse and wide-ranging individuals and organizations who gather to harness their abilities, develop partnerships, exchange vital science, and chart pathways towards a more humane, equitable, and inclusive society for all. Guided by evidence and the science of what helps to deliver our shared health objectives and social goals, we are further able to protect, respect, and fulfill the right to health without prejudice or stigma. This is the true potential of harm reduction practices. Harm reduction improves public health, is cost-effective, may decrease or eliminate risky practices among people who use drugs, and significantly reduces disease transmission and fatal overdose. Therefore, supporting and strengthening harm reduction services in all regions around the world is an essential tool in the delicate balancing act of sustaining and transforming human life. With this in mind, could the harm reduction context serve as an inspiration and a platform for us to innovate new ways to organize and coordinate our campaigns? To answer that question, we need to dip into history. It was on December 10, 1948, with the birth of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that UN member states pledged to promote respect for the human rights of all. However, for the purposes of this conference, let us fast forward to 1961, UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs that listed those substances that required strict legal controls. In an article in Criminology and Criminal Justice by Stuart Taylor, Julian Buchanan, and Tammy Ayers, entitled Prohibition, Privilege, and Drug Apartheid, the Failure of Drug Policy Reform to Address the Underlying Fallacies of Drug Prohibition. The authors eloquently explain the following, which may shed light on a global pattern of power dynamics, and allow me perhaps to paraphrase, quote, policies of drug decriminalization, legalization, and regulation are materializing in a number of jurisdictions around the world, a phenomena welcomed by critics of prohibition who have long exposed its lack of evidence-based efficacy and legitimacy, close quote. Whilst these reforms have been posited as progressive, Taylor, Buchanan, and Ayers argue that they represent merely a metamorphosis of prohibition, whereby the face of drug policy changes, yet the fundamental principles remain unaffected. They go on to illustrate how inadvertently this reform revolution camouflages the underlying contradictions that have lain at the heart of global drug policy since they were enshrined in the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961. By exposing how the fundamental inconsistencies of drug prohibition continue to be accommodated in policy reform, the authors identify the untenable flawed assumptions underpinning drug law enforcement and prohibition, and that certain fallacies used to legitimize drug prohibition lack an evidence base and instead draw upon myth and reductionist discourse that obscures nuanced drug policy debate. These fallacies arbitrarily frame particular substances as drugs, omitting other substances as legal and socially acceptable, and skew the risks of drug use by focusing almost exclusively on specific types of use and users, and concentrating attention upon apparent associated negative outcomes. The authors reveal how this process allows certain substances to attain an unwarranted position of privilege, whilst others are prohibited, creating what they term a drug apartheid, a deeply divisive system of segregation and punishment determined by the substance used. With a focus on marginalized minorities, Black and Indigenous peoples, Taylor, Buchanan, and Ayers succinctly go on to give reason for how the central tenets of prohibition remain within liberal reforms. That is, the ability to criminalize and severely punish those who use drugs. They explain how such processes have been historically steeped in prejudice, resulting in a racially motivated war on drugs, and despite reform, discrimination and inequality endures. No doubt, some, if not many delegates here today, may agree that given the lack of evidence and scientific analysis upholding both prohibition and well-intentioned reforms, that a repeal of drug laws is necessary. With history as a teacher, we may witness how the human race certainly waits until it hangs precariously on the precipice before it rallies to organize, to respond, and to act. For a change in course, away from an abyss of enduring suffering, all indicators point to harm reduction as model for humanity. It was repeated throughout many of our discussions that there is a need to address the challenges faced in the implementation of harm reduction services. In many places, availability, accessibility, and quality of services remain important issues to tackle, while services are also unevenly distributed in most countries. Since the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, it has had the impact of adding extra layers of challenges to communities around the world, and particularly for people who use drugs. In countries where harm reduction services exist, they were often forced to close or be reduced, and public health was militarized. In Africa, the pandemic has had a debilitating impact on HIV and harm reduction service, as limited operating hours, fewer outreach programs, and economic challenges resulted in poorer access to services and increased risk-taking. However, such crises also demonstrated the resilience of services led by people who use drugs, who adapted their operations to ensure that people in need could still benefit from opioid agonist therapy and other relevant services. By recognizing that prohibition and criminalization have put people at even more risk, further stigmatizing and marginalizing people who use drugs and who are involved in drug trafficking and production, we encourage local and national governments to adopt a public health and human rights approach to drug policies based on scientific evidence. To this end, the Global Commission recommends 5 pathways to drug policies that work. 1, put people's health and safety first. 2, ensure access to essential medicines and pain control. 3, end the criminalization and incarceration of people who use drugs. 4, refocus enforcement responses to drug trafficking and organized crime. And lastly, regulate drug markets to put governments in control. However, even within the harm reduction services, there lies a stark empathy gap. How do we narrow this gap to ensure that no one falls through the cracks of this divide? Perhaps it is by applying an expanded contextual understanding that stigma already exists for marginalized people, and that the negative effects of shame and exclusion doubles down on the stigma of substance use disorder and those who use drugs. However, it takes political will and leadership to implement harm reduction practices. No two countries nor communities are exactly the same, and therefore it may be helpful to have customized programs which involve the marginalized and people who use drugs. And tailoring the interventions to suit a community allows us to add to the knowledge pool and advance harm reduction. And so, if we are to interrogate with intentionality how we can be more helpful and reduce harm, then we are to organize and mobilize for the investment of more resources and dedicate more of ourselves to the study and development of harm reduction services in more communities, more people everywhere. Again, taking history as a shepherd, we may understand more clearly that the future is not a place we are going to, but a place we create through our own actions. And in so doing, we must support and propel more platforms such as the Human Reduction International Conference to further refine the definition of our historical mission. Yes, that is what it is. It is a historical mission. To affect and influence policy, and therefore to shape the outcomes we hope for, we must organize ourselves for common benefit. Through solidarity, we must be conscious that our agency as civil society must come to the fore, that these issues are not just for one organization, but for all of civil society to further unite as an organized movement for the common good. During the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, a global anti-apartheid movement developed. For instance, in the United States of America, an organization called Trans-Africa, led by Randall Robinson, tracked down and called out American corporates that were investing in South Africa under the oppressive regime in order to isolate these companies in support for the call to disinvest from apartheid. So, what is needed is a global movement which can coordinate and share information so that campaigns can be mounted in each and every country. Generally speaking, people always form organizations for a purpose, and so the point is to find synergies and meeting points in pursuance of a common cause, like rivulets which decant into a mainstream. This conference not only serves as an opportunity to reflect, but to identify new ways to increase our voice and to coordinate and channel our efforts towards the creation of a fair and just world order. Let today, the last day of the conference, be the first day of our re-energized and more concerted effort to improve drug policy at local, to regional, and to global levels. There is strength in solidarity, so let us capitalize on that by matching capital's ability to nestle and settle everywhere in the world. And finally, if we may suggest a watchword for those who use drugs and marginalized communities, it would be Nothing about us without us. Thank you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, President Motlanthe. I think I speak for everyone when I pause to reflect how powerful it is to have a former president come forward, guided by logic, guided by science, a sense of compassion and justice, and we can hear that message loud and clear. So thank you again. Next, I'm so pleased to introduce the Honourable Gabrielle Williams, Minister for Mental Health, Minister for Ambulance Services, and Minister for Treaty and First Peoples. She's proudly represented her local community as the member for Dandenong in the Victorian Parliament since 2014. Minister, it means a lot to us that you can be here today as we gather in Melbourne. Welcome.
Thanks, Naomi, for that very warm welcome, and thank you also, former President Motlanthe, for a wonderful address and a very inspiring one. It's such a pleasure to be able to share a stage with you. Before I begin, please let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're currently gathered, the Wurundjeri people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any other elders we may have here with us today, and to say those words not out of habit, but to reflect on the journey that we're on here in Victoria towards truth-telling and treaty, and now the national journey that we are on here in Australia towards a voice, a constitutional recognition of our First Peoples, many, many, many years too late, but so very important to achieving better outcomes for our First Nations people now and into the future. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge and welcome the many of you here today with lived or living experience of substance use, as well as your families and your supporters, and commend you on your advocacy. I always reflect on the fact that it's such a profound act of generosity to share your own stories and your own experiences, many of which will be negative experiences, so that you can ultimately improve the lives of others and ensure that others don't have those negative experiences. It is not only a profound act of generosity, but it is also one of the most meaningful acts of public service any person can give. And I also want to acknowledge that I know for many in our community, that process comes at a cost. It can be, and it can involve reliving personal trauma, all for the greater good. So I wanted to spend some time acknowledging that. And also, I guess, to acknowledge in that the impact of stigma and discrimination, and how much a part of so many of your stories that will be. And hopefully I'll have a chance to talk to that shortly. I also, of course, want to honour and recognise our former president, as I've acknowledged earlier, and of course Her Excellency Ms. Gugu Motlanthe as well, who I had a great discussion with before coming onto stage earlier. I know we also had former Prime Minister Helen Clark here throughout the conference, which somebody who I am a huge fan of, what a powerhouse she is, so very pleased to see that she was a part of this conference as well. And my fellow speakers here with us today, Paul Hunt and Judy Chang, such a pleasure to be able to meet you both here today. And other dignitaries who have been in and out of this conference over the last few days and sharing their wisdom with us. I feel like I should also acknowledge the two people who constituted my cheer squad upon my announcement earlier, about half an hour ago, which is, of course, Fiona Patton, who is down here as a former member of the Legislative Council in the Victorian Parliament, and someone who will be known to many of our local delegates here, and Judy Ryan, who has long been an advocate, especially for our medically supervised injecting room here in North Richmond, and I know many of you have been out to see that. I also want to extend my welcome and thanks to Victoria's talented and thoughtful leaders in harm reduction, including Sione Crawford and the wonderful team at Harm Reduction Victoria. It is challenging work. It is challenging work. It is often in a difficult context. These are conversations that you're driving that aren't always easily had, and the doors aren't always open to you. But I'm very grateful for your perspective and your wisdom and your generosity, particularly for me being fairly new to this role, in sharing that with me, so thank you. It's testament to your expertise and hard work that so many leaders, I think, in this field have come from around the world to Melbourne to participate in this conference. I think that says a lot about the importance of the discussions that have taken place here, and also says a lot about your individual and collective contributions to these issues. So thank you again. Look, it's such a pleasure to be able to be here, albeit on a fairly tight time frame, so if I do have to disappear quickly after this, I apologise. But to be here for the closing of what has clearly been such a vibrant conference, the program shows such an astounding breadth and thought leadership, policy debate, and something very close to my heart, compassion. What is most apparent to me about the harm reduction community, whether that be ordinary people, practitioners, advocates, policymakers, academics in these fields, is the deep and abiding commitment to fairness, to justice, and as a conference theme explores, to collaboration. And I'm sure many of you here today have reflected on whether governments can truly ever be a collaborative partner with the harm reduction community, but I'm here to say that I believe we can. The context of drug criminalisation certainly makes for difficult conversations. I want to acknowledge that at the outset, but I'm sure that you'll agree that difficult conversations are the ones that really do create meaningful change. I was elected to the Victorian Parliament in 2014, and in the not too far off 10 years since, I've seen the community and the government wrestle with some really difficult conversations and issues, both inside and outside of the Parliament, and which have led to some big changes and some small changes, and I'm sure with more to come. And one of the big changes that's taken place here in Victoria has been the establishment of the medically supervised injecting room. And a recent independent review of that injecting service, chaired by John Ryan, found that since its establishment in 2018, that service has succeeded in achieving the trial's central objectives, which is to save lives. And that to that end, there have been more than 6,000 overdose events safely managed, which means a projected 63 lives saved on those numbers. But more than that, a lot of people, far more than 6,000, connected to the services that they need, not always directly related to their drug use. Sometimes things as simple as dental services, health checks, things that we all need to maintain healthy lives and to feel better in and of ourselves. The Victorian Labor government has committed to making this service permanent now. It was initially on a trial basis, and we currently have a bill before Victoria's Parliament to enact and embed that change. I had the pleasure of visiting the facility yesterday morning and met with the amazing team from North Richmond Community Health who deliver that service, and I know many of you here in the room in the last couple of days have taken the opportunity to tour that facility, and I hope it's provided you with food for thought. And I was reflecting earlier that education goes both ways, so while it might have given you some of you ideas to take back to your home countries, I'm sure you've got some feedback for us as well in how things could be done better, and that exchange, I believe, is also really important. I also want to reflect on some of the seemingly smaller but hard-won changes to the law relating to peer distribution of needles and syringes and naloxone. Victoria's take-home naloxone program will commence in coming months, and it will enable needle and syringe programs to distribute naloxone alongside other NSP supplies, as well as the provision of free naloxone from pharmacies. So legislative change here in 2022, thank you. Legislative change also enshrined the right of peers to distribute naloxone in their communities, and I don't think we can underestimate the impact of that change. This will save lives, it will give more Victorians a chance to recover from addiction, and this was a policy success truly driven by our lived experience community, recognising the tireless work here of Jane Dicker of Harm Reduction Victoria with collaboration. With collaboration and support of local advocates like John Ryan and academics like Paul Ditzer. They work extensively with government to enact changes like these, and I want to thank them and many others like them for your steadfast advocacy. I also want to highlight that lived experience has been core not just to changes here around drug policy, but also an instrumental voice for harm reduction through the Sex Work Decriminalisation Act 2022, which is underpinned by a very simple proposition, which is that sex work is work. And this important piece of legislation, and it's very lovely to have Fiona Patton in the room to hear this, somebody who was also instrumental in this change, but this important piece of legislation seeks to destigmatise sex work and give sex workers the same rights and protections as any other Victorian worker. It means that sex workers in Victoria will no longer be forced to make what is an absolutely impossible choice between working legally or keeping themselves safe. And I'm so pleased that people no longer have to make that decision. Point taken. I'd like to recognise both the National Peak Sex Worker Organisation, the Scarlet Alliance, Victorian Peer Organisation, Vixen, for their ongoing advocacy, and also the Sex Work Law Reform Committee, just a few of the voices that were part of those changes. And similarly, across the world, drug policy is at a time of transformative change, I think, as this conference represents. Change and reform, and in Victoria we're determined to ensure that we have lived and living experience at the heart of that work. In recent years, one of the hallmarks of the transformation underway in the alcohol and other drugs portfolio, which I have the pleasure of holding, is the emphasis on a health-led approach to drug and alcohol use, and I know the President mentioned the importance of health approaches as well. To me, health-led approaches mean embracing the solutions that empower people and take care of themselves and others, supported by good service delivery, of course, and a wider community. But it's also about destigmatisation, about destigmatising these issues. And I'm often given cause to reflect on the fact that stigma is such a wicked, wicked barrier to progress. And we've got to do something about that, and it's incumbent upon people like me to be involved in that process in partnership with all of you. It's impossible to truly serve someone's needs without collaborating with them on what support means for them at that time or place, and in that context that they are in, of their families as well, and their communities that they're a part of. A health-led approach is inherently collaborative. So where do we see this health-led approach in the policies of the Victorian government today? Well, last year the Victorian Labor government invested about $313 million in AOD services, including responding to global supply pressures for critical harm reduction products. And today the Andrews Labor government, people with lived and living experience, service providers, workforces and the community at large are working together to roll out health-led support for people who are intoxicated in public, so that we can repeal the astonishingly outdated public drunkenness offence. Now, by accepting the challenge of a health-led approach, we must make a commitment to doing better at a systems level and responding to people's needs and respecting their choices. Finally, over the past few months, I've heard Victoria's AOD sector talk a lot about the challenge challenges, there's several of them, in the opioid pharmacotherapy treatment system, both locally and nationally. And we are, of course, privileged to have the leadership of Harm Reduction Victoria, both as an advocate and for the delivery of the Pharmacotherapy Advocacy and Medication Service phone line, better known as PAMS. And I'd like to take a moment to recognise the incredible work of the PAMS team, who undertake very tough and complex work connecting those who want access to opioid treatment with prescribers and pharmacists, which is not always easy work. So thank you to the PAMS team for making such a huge difference in people's lives. And to that end also, thank you to those prescribers and dispensers who are performing such vital work. We know that there is a lot more work to do, and we know that there are challenges that we must confront to get better outcomes in this area. So look, over coming months, I hope to talk to Victoria's harm reduction community and, of course, the AOD sector about what needs to be done over the longer term to get more focus on this sector in order to drive better outcomes for those who depend on it. Earlier, I acknowledged that it can be difficult for people with a lived and living experience of drug use to collaborate with government. We do want to hear more from you, and quite frankly, policymakers like me and many others like me need to enter into those discussions in earnest and make sure that we are listening to those views and to those ideas that I know are in vast supply among you all. Look, as a community, we achieve nothing without collaboration and without these difficult conversations, and I know I keep emphasising that they are difficult because they are. And part of being able to overcome that is addressing it from the outset and coming to these discussions with open hearts and open minds. So thank you again for the opportunity to join you all this afternoon and for your continued work and advocacy across global harm reduction. It's been such a delight to be able to join you, but also so wonderful to see such a vibrant conversation happening right here in Victoria, where I hope it will spark many, many more conversations and hopefully some great partnerships into the future.
Thank you, Minister, for that important message about peer workforce and peer collaboration and peer leadership. Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce you all to Paul Hunt. Paul studied law. He's lived and undertaken human rights work in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and New Zealand. For more than a decade, Paul served as an independent human rights expert for the United Nations, reporting to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. His focus was on healthcare and health protection, and between 2011 and 2013, he was a senior human rights advisor to the World Health Organization Assistant Director General. Paul was appointed New Zealand's Chief Human Rights Commissioner in 2019, and last year he was awarded the Anne Dysart Distinguished Service Award by the Civil Society organisation Multicultural New Zealand. Now, above and beyond all of that, Paul Hunt holds a very special place in the heart of the harm reduction movement. Way back in 2008, when he addressed the conference in Barcelona, he articulated something that we all had in our minds and we couldn't quite put our finger on, this concept of parallel universes, the idea that states go forward and forget that they can say one thing in Vienna and one thing in Geneva and that drug control is completely incompatible with human rights. And by articulating that, I feel like Paul has really set the vision for the movement, and the work that we've done over the past 15 years has really broken down those barriers, really broken down those parallel universes as we work to connect Geneva and Vienna. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul and ask him what he thinks of the human rights movement today.
Thank you, Naomi. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and they've looked after this land for tens of thousands of years, and we are all indebted to them. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Talofa lava, salam alaikum, shalom, namaste, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Harm Reduction International for inviting me to join you, and I want to thank everyone who made it possible, who advised me, who made my participation possible. Colleagues in Harm Reduction International, not least Naomi, but there are many others. If I could just mention the conference directors, Maddie and Louisa. Also old friends like Arjun. And there's also the Harm Reduction Victoria, who I know have worked incredibly hard with many others on this enterprise. So forgive me for not mentioning everybody. I know these events take a huge amount of work from many people. Thank you all. I also want to thank my colleagues in the New Zealand Human Rights Commission who made my participation possible, Tamsin Jordan, Delia, Nolan, and others. And a special thank you to Callum Stewart, a doctoral candidate here at the University of Melbourne, for his very helpful remarks. And I acknowledge my august panelists. I also wish to underscore the incredible work that every one of you are engaged in. All the work that you're doing to advance harm reduction, to reduce the risks associated with drug use. You're saving lives. You're reducing avoidable suffering. Your calling is inspirational, and your achievements are wonderful. As Naomi mentioned, 15 years ago, at your conference in Barcelona, when serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on health rights, I tried to convey that drug use, laws and policies are human rights issues, and people who use drugs are routinely subject to multiple human rights violations. I explained that most states have signed up to the human rights to health care and the human right to health protection. This means they have legally binding international obligations to do everything they reasonably can to roll out harm reduction. And states also have legally binding international obligations to do everything they reasonably can to build an effective, integrated, responsive health system encompassing health care and the underlying determinants of health. This health system must be responsive to the needs of disadvantaged individuals and communities, including people who use drugs. I applaud those of you who presently deploy human rights in your work. I know that's not easy to do. And for those of you who don't yet use human rights in your work, I implore you to learn a little about human rights, including to the right to health care and the right to health protection as enshrined in binding international human rights law and also binding in some national legal systems, such as in South Africa. As I said in Barcelona, human rights do not provide magic solutions to really complex issues because there are no magic solutions, but human rights have a constructive contribution to make in numerous ways, big and small. So I urge you to do what you can to integrate human rights into your inspiring work. 15 years on, I want to make some brief remarks about colonization and human rights in relation to harm reduction. Colonization over the last 500 years is the biggest heist in history. Colonization remains the major issue of our time, especially in settler colonies like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. Colonization shapes our constitutions, our politics, our land ownership, our economics, our well-being, our way of thinking, and much, much more. Those of us who are non-Indigenous are not responsible for the conduct of our predecessors. In my opinion, there is no place for ancestral guilt in our societies, but we have responsibilities to grasp what happened, to recognize our continuing privilege, and to do all we can to put things right. A number of people has written about decolonizing drug policy and decolonizing harm reduction, and some of the authors are in this hall, so I speak with some trepidation on these topics. And if I get it wrong, I apologize. Like everyone else, I'm here to learn. Some practitioner authors have explored how drug control has upheld colonial power structures in some countries. They've demonstrated the racist and xenophobic impact of drug control. They've proposed ways to move beyond oppressive systems and structures. Another author argues there is a need to decolonize harm reduction alongside decolonizing drug policies. Today, it's widely recognized that intergenerational trauma arising from colonization, such as violence, theft of land, discrimination, this contributes to damaging drug use among indigenous peoples. There's a policy brief that some of you will know, a policy brief called Indigenous Harm Reduction equals reducing the harms of colonialism. And it says this: Indigenous harm reduction is a way of life embedded within traditional knowledge systems that see the spiritual world, the natural world, and humanity as interrelated. And the policy brief continues, Indigenous harm reduction must go beyond addressing substance use and interrogate the neo-colonial systems and structures that shape and constrain the lives of Indigenous peoples. As Rawiri Evans from Aotearoa put it, Indigenous harm reduction means reducing the harms of colonialism. These are immense issues. Some of you may know the seminal, brilliant article called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." The authors explained that decolonization is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies. They continue like this. They say, decolonization is not a philanthropic process of helping the at-risk and alleviating suffering. Decolonization is not a generic term for struggle against oppressive conditions and outcomes. The broad umbrella of social justice may have room for all of these efforts, but they say, by contrast, decolonization specifically requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. Decolonization is not a substitute for social justice. The authors conclude, decolonization offers a different perspective to human rights-based approaches to justice, an unsettling perspective rather than a complementary one. And the authors try to soften that by explaining this. They say, we don't intend to discourage those who have dedicated lives and careers to teaching themselves and others to be critically conscious of racism and sexism and homophobia and classism and xenophobia and settler colonialism. So the authors don't pull their punches, and neither should they, because they continue like this. They say, we are asking the reader to consider how the pursuit of social justice can also be diversions, can also be distractions, which conceal the need to give up land, power, or privilege. So, colleagues, as a privileged, non-Indigenous, lifelong human rights worker, do I think that human rights have a decolonial role to play, or are human rights diversions? Are they distractions? In my opinion, today's prevailing understanding of human rights has great merit. but it also reflects a truncated view of humanity. I think we need to refresh human rights. And if we do that, human rights can become a tool that contributes to decolonization. We must embrace both human rights, which tend to be individualistic, and also embrace indigenous rights, which tend to have a collective orientation. I'm not saying that human and indigenous rights alone can achieve decolonization. I'm saying they can probably help us get there. But what are the features of human rights that need refreshing? What are these features of human rights that need reclaiming? Importantly, some of these features are already emergent. One is this: we need to widen the values that are embodied in human rights. Values such as stewardship, kaitiakitanga, respect, manaakitanga, the values of community, of belonging, of responsibility, of well-being, dignity, fairness, equality and equity, freedom and safety. Another feature is this: we have to insist upon the wide spectrum of human rights. That includes civil rights and political rights and workers' rights and social rights and cultural rights and indigenous peoples' rights and the right to a healthy environment, and discrimination and equality and equity. And it's this wide spectrum which includes the right to health care, the right to health protection, the right to a decent home, all of which are so important in relation to harm reduction. A third feature is this: we need to recognize that individuals not only have human rights entitlements, they also have human rights responsibilities to each other, to communities, and to the environment, papatuanuku. Fourth, powerful companies have to understand that they have human rights responsibilities too, as repeatedly confirmed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Fifth, we need to build harmonious relationships within and between communities, because human rights are not only about I and me, they are also about we and us. Sixth, we have to learn better how to strike fair and reasonable balances between competing human rights. Seventh, we have to develop new non-adversarial, non-judicial forms of human rights accountability. Eighth, we must recognize intergenerationality. That is, recognition of past, present, and future generations, which is so important in the context of colonization and also climate change. And ninth, we need to respect epistemologies that encompass indigenous understandings of knowledge. And 10, we need a process of truth-telling, a process of reconciliation, a process of justice, and that might possibly contribute to decolonial constitutional transformation. I leave others to explore indigenous rights, and there will be other occasions to explore the relationship between human rights and indigenous rights. But it's really important to grasp that non-indigenous people have nothing to fear, and they have much to gain from human rights and indigenous rights. And in Barcelona, I encouraged you to embrace a human rights approach to your work. And today I say we must tackle decolonization, by which I mean the repatriation of Indigenous land, life, and authority. The most effective form of Indigenous harm reduction is decolonisation. So today, I encourage you to refresh human rights, as I've sought to indicate, and embrace a human and Indigenous rights approach to your life-enhancing work. I doubt this approach alone will realize decolonisation, but it'll probably help us get there. And I hope to see you in 15 years' time. Inshallah, and kia ora.
You heard it here first. See you in 15 years' time. So next, it is my very great pleasure to introduce our last speaker for the day. After Judy, we've got a bit of a variety show to wrap up. But first, Judy Chang is the Executive Director of the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, INPUD. Judy has worked in the HIV and community-based health and development field for 15 years. She brings over 20 years of lived experience as a woman who uses drugs as a client of harm reduction services. During the course of her work, she's worked in India, China, and Thailand. I think this list needs to be updated, Judy. I've seen you work beyond that. She holds a master's degree in international development and a Bachelor of Arts in Writing and Contemporary Cultures. Above and beyond all of this, Judy took on the role of Executive Director of INPUD about a year before I took on the role at HRI. And I've watched her with absolute awe, break open doors, take seats of power, and really bring the community voice to places it's never been before. So I am so excited to have Judy here to close our closing ceremony.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Naomi. Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So it was actually in 2019 I was asked to do the closing ceremony in Porto, and unfortunately I was not able to attend, but it does feel very serendipitous because it meant I could do the closing ceremony this time, and I find myself in Australia, which is the country that I grew up in. So thank you, Harm Reduction International, for inviting me. So the brief that we got as panelists was to be forward-looking, but I do feel compelled, being in Australia, to do some looking back and also some digging into, some of my personal experiences. So as Naomi mentioned, I've been in the position of Executive Director of INPUD for 6 years, but I don't often or speak too often about my personal experiences or really, dig deep. Partly that could be to do with entrenched, internalized stigma, but also, one of the reasons is because I think that our role as drug user advocates is, should not only be limited to telling our personal stories, and, we don't want to be reduced to trauma porn. So without doubt, there is undeniable power in sharing our personal stories, and there are lessons to be learnt, but we are also analytical, tactical, and strategic advocates, and also brilliant service providers. So Australia is where I began my career as a woman who uses drugs from the age of 14. I was definitely privileged because of the strong user rights advocacy that has gone on for decades. I was able to easily access needles and syringes whether from fixed sites, pharmacies, vending machines, or delivered to my door in mobile vans at 3 a.m. in the morning. You don't really get that anywhere else. It was in Sydney that I started on opiate agonist treatment, which I've been able to continue in India, Hong Kong, and now Italy. Because of sex work, I was able to survive, earn money, pay rent, and regulate my life. It was definitely a safety net. But it was also the place where I learnt the universal shaming and stigma that comes along with coming out as a person who uses drugs or not being able to hide drug use. Without doubt, I've also been privileged enough to not be systematically hunted down and targeted by police in the ways that Indigenous and First Nation people have been in Australia. But it is almost impossible under the war on drugs to not experience violence as a drug user. And this violence happens with impunity. It was also the place where it was constantly drilled into me that I should be ashamed of what I am. Sorry, just water break. So why then, as drug user advocates, do we stand up in the face of stigma, shame, and criminalization? It is sometimes said that all activists bear a wound, that activism is grounded in the belief that all is not right with the world, and we are thus driven by compulsion to work to right the wrongs. Many of us may have grown up on the sidelines, but this means learning to reject other people's interpretation of the world. Being a first-generation migrant, I already understood marginalization and felt the silent rootlessness and emptiness of unbelonging that many of us do, but especially Black, Indigenous, people of color, gay, and non-binary. And this means we've had to develop basic survival tactics early on in life. I grew up as a ward of the state, and from the age of 12, spent my adolescence in refuges and care homes, attending a selective school in Sydney, so spending my days with a group of young women and that were told that we could achieve anything in life. But in the evenings, then I was back in care homes and refuges and living with, a group of youth who had experienced abandonment, abuse, and, there's rarely this talk about, futures. So the reason I speak about this is because, some of the lessons that I learned from this, and I had to learn it early on, that there definitely is no equal playing field, that our whole lives are arbitrarily shaped by laws and policies and application of those laws and policies. And these expand and contract our horizon of possibilities and affect how we feel about ourselves. So the war on drugs is the biggest, most entrenched policy failure of our time, with many vested interests that keep that system going, creating so much harm around the world, especially impacting Black, Indigenous, people of color, poor, sex workers and migrants, amongst other oppressed people. It's because of criminalization that good people are spending time in cages for simply using or holding a substance. Many of us have lost people we love to the drug war. And it's because of the war on drugs that children are growing up without parents, that people lose their jobs, are expelled from schools, cut off from social protection, and disconnected from freedom, family, and friends. As drug user advocates, we all know that feeling of being chipped away at. We are constantly up against the stereotypes that we are, if not immoral and criminal, then passive, incapacitated, and unable to make sound opinions, let alone affect political and social change. In looking forwards and envisioning a future, we must not be satisfied with superficial tinkering, but expose the script of the war on drugs and change the way people who use drugs are perceived and how we see and talk about drug use itself. Changing narratives around drug use is recognizing that drug use is an inherent part of human existence and always has been and always will be. We're criminalizing substances that have been and will be around longer than any of us. There are political motivations for portraying us as weak, immoral, and helpless. And it's not only prohibitionists who are interested in pushing this view. More often than not, we are merely tolerated, patronized, or coddled up to use as tools in other people's agendas. But from my experience, people who use drugs are the best people I have known. The thinkers. The thinkers, the misfits, the pleasure-seeking, the funny and fun-loving, the adventurous risk-takers. And what does it say about our society that we punish the risk-takers when it has always been the risk-takers who drive the engines of social progress, who experiment, who refuse societal norms and break new ground, whether in music, art, science, economics, politics, and literature? It should come as no surprise that it is the most authoritarian governments that are hell-bent on punishing difference, in denying services and basic treatment, and taking away people's freedoms. So in fighting back, we must not be content with piecemeal reforms or trade-offs that substitute one oppressive system for another, but fight for a complete overhaul. Framing drug use and dependency as a disease rather than a criminal offense, or defining people who use drugs as a patient rather than a criminal, does not automatically do away with social control nor stigma. We're simply swapping one type of oppression with another, moralizing with another, pathologizing. And these are not binary opposites. Prohibitionist imperatives bleed into health systems and responses all the time. Across jurisdictions, we see compulsory drug detention or compulsory treatment being forced on people, where conditions are often measurably worse than prisons. It's a perverse situation, made more perverse because it's happening under the guise of help and support. As advocates, we push for the scale-up of harm reduction, but in many cases, the roots of harm reduction have been sold out to moral agendas of abstinence. So most of the time in harm reduction programs, we see the primary indicator of success being whether people continue to use drugs or not. And within harm reduction programs, many of us, or within OAT programs and those familiar with them, many times we're also punished if we are defined as bad. And this involves cutting doses or expelling from programs. In these programs, we're characterized as good patients, that is docile and compliant, or bad patients, combative and non-compliant. This dichotomy is a manifestation of drug-related stigma, forcing us into respectability politics that does harm. Decent care should not be subject to whether we use drugs or not. In looking forwards, people and equity must be at the center. And these two elements were reflected in the Global Aid Strategy and the Global Fund Strategy. So then it is drug user groups that offer the best way to give people positive connections to identity and experiences, to our identity and experiences, so that we can lift all boats. Drug user-led networks collectivise demands for more and better services, for decriminalisation, for full decriminalisation, and they are the best antidote to stigma and discrimination. The movement is about refusing to quietly bear the stigma and shame and letting drug use rot in a closet of shame. It's about action and taking control. To refuse feeling cowed and constrained and refuse being rendered invisible, because invisibility forces us into second-class existence. But criminalisation decimates and is decimating our movements, with hundreds of thousands of lives lost to the war on drugs each year through overdose and neglect. Coming out as an active drug user is a risk in and of itself, and stress and burnout is heartbreakingly all too common. And yet, we continue and find new ways and adopt new strategies to survive, especially as we're up against a growing chorus of anti-rights and anti-gender movements that are well-funded. In looking forwards, and I know it's been mentioned a few times throughout the conference, but I just want to emphasize the importance of rooting ourselves in broader social justice movements. Like these movements, such as anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, racial equity, Indigenous rights movements, the drug user rights movement is about resilience and fighting back. It's about refusing to buy the lie of respectability politics, of what is normal and what is not. It's about changing the narrative, it's about rights. It's about what I as a human being can do with my body. And just paraphrasing Cassandra Frederick from the opening ceremony, she mentioned that we must demand more of partnerships. We want more than lip service. We want to change the status quo. And we want to make sure that we don't use the master, we put down the master's tools. If we really need to effect change, we also need to be redistributing power and resources. We need donors to step up and stop stigma from affecting funding decisions. If the drug policy movement is serious about social justice, then there needs to be a tipping point where having non-drug users leading on representing the needs and perspectives of people who use drugs is considered as egregious as having, say, men leading the women's movement. And what? And white people speaking for Black, Indigenous, and people of colour. We can't be committed to decolonisation without decentering, and that means for people, organisations, and governments. Surviving prohibition and still fighting should not be taken for granted. Still fighting and surviving should not be taken for granted. It does damage to shout and have no one listen. So I just want to end on an excerpt of an Audre Lorde poem, A Litany for Survival. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it may not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it may not rise in the morning. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
So we have one award to be presented today, an announcement, and an announcement of a new award. We have a short conference film where you can watch out to see yourself. And then we are delighted that Harm Reduction Victoria and Partners will be presenting the conference declaration. And then you will sit through my list of thank yous and share my joy. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Mohammed Karamouzian, a research scientist at the Centre on Drug Policy Evaluation, who will present the 2023 Brooklyn McNeil Ray Award.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting today on, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present this award. I'm honored to present the Brooklyn McNeil Ray of Hope Award on behalf of the Centre on Drug Policy Evaluation in Toronto, Canada. The Centre on Drug Policy Evaluation collaborates with governments, affected communities, civil society, to enhance community health and safety through research on effective evidence-based drug policies. This award honors the best research abstract in the area of drug policy and harm reduction submitted to the Harm Reduction 23 conference, as voted by a panel of experts. The winner received a waiver to publish in the peer-reviewed open access harm reduction journal, as well as 830 Australian dollars. Conversion rates. The award is in honor of Brooklyn Ray McNeil, a prominent advocate for safer injection sites and a vital support in the lives of many people who use drugs in Toronto, Canada. As a harm reduction activist whose life was cut too short as a result of an accidental overdose, Brooklyn's spirit serves as a constant reminder of the need to conduct research and evidence-based advocacy to prevent the senseless loss of lives that could be avoided with drug policies grounded in evidence and human rights. In honor of Brooklyn Ray McNeil, I'm pleased to announce that this year's award goes to Dr. Deep Nguyen for the abstract results after 6-month pilot implementation of the methadone take-home program in Vietnam. This abstract reports on a methadone take-home program piloted in 3 provinces in Vietnam in 2021 to improve treatment outcomes. Based on this mixed methods study, after 6 months, the program was found to be feasible and acceptable in both rural and urban areas, with a retention rate of 88% and low rates of missed doses. Dr. Nguyen and colleagues found that both providers and patients acknowledged the benefits of the program, but providers' work burden was not reduced as expected. They suggest that relaxing treatment guidelines may help reduce the burden and facilitate expansion and sustainability of the program. I leave it to you to read about their paper when it's out. Unfortunately, Dr. Deep could not be with us here at the conference, but Dr. Tam, who is a co-author on the abstract, is here and will receive the award on behalf of their team.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's our honor to be here and to receive this award. Actually, I work for the harm reduction program nearly 20 years. Mostly in the field of the policy development, program implementation, and I also work very closely with the institution to conduct the research. With the purpose is to do the research to provide the evidence for policy development. And this work also is a great emotion for us, and encourage us continue work in the field of harm reduction. In this occasion, I also would like to thank for the UN family, UNS, UNODC, WHO, and another donor like Grown Fund that's always hand in hand with us from the beginning of the harm reduction program that provide both technical and financial support for us to do harm reduction program. And special thanks go to Dr. David Zaka. He's 50 years ago, he's a WHO consultant in Vietnam, and we work with us from the first methadone clinic in Vietnam. And now we expand methadone program nationwide with more than 22,000 patients on methadone. And with the need and accident program, we are now able to control HIV epidemic among the people who inject the drug, with the HIV incident among people who inject drugs now in Vietnam around 0.5 per 100 person a year. And Dr. David Zaka, thanks a lot for your support from the beginning. And I still remember you said that at the first clinic in Vietnam, you always hand in hand with the medical doctor in order to avoid Vietnamese doctor kill anybody. Sorry. Okay, once again, thanks a lot for the support.
Today we're also honoured to offer the stage for the announcement of a new award celebrating the life of Jimmy Durabji. Jimmy was a pioneer in international harm reduction and a major figure in the movement in Asia. And we're also really delighted that Jimmy's partner, Del, Jamset and Shura are here. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the Durabji Award here today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. I also pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I thank everyone for attending the final session. Congratulations to you all. It's quite fitting that we follow the Vietnamese experience because Jimmy was very committed to the work that happens in Asia. He died in November 2019. He was a brother, an uncle, a father, and a grandfather to many people in our sector. I first met Jimmy in 1998 at the Sao Paulo Harm Reduction meeting, just 2 years after the establishment of the Asian Harm Reduction Network. And I'd like to acknowledge Nick for all of the work that you did in supporting the groups of Asian drug users and activists who came together at that meeting in Hobart in 1996 to establish that very important network. I was a friend of Jimmy's and a work colleague until his death. 3 decades later, the network of Asian people who use drugs continues as the voice for many people who, for structural reasons, are unable to be in a position to speak about the issues they care about. Jimmy was a key part of the reason why many of these networks were established and why they still exist today. Jimmy mentored and inspired many. He epitomised lived experience and peer education. He was truly an inspirational leader in harm reduction, and this award will ensure that Jimmy's legacy to harm reduction and to the rights of people who use drugs is remembered and acknowledged. It's fitting that today, the 19th of April, is actually also the day he married Del. And it's, as Naomi said, Del and his 2 children, Jamshi and Sher, are both here to celebrate the acknowledgement of this award, and I am proud to announce that the Burnett Institute, who was the last place for which Jimmy was working and worked for so many years, together with the network of Asian people who use drugs and the international network of people who use drugs, have established the Durabji Award into perpetuity. The award will be annually provide scholarships for 2 people, with lived experience and working in the field of harm reduction to attend a conference of their choice, and at least one of these people will be from Asia. The actual specifics and the timing of the award will be promoted through our harm reduction networks and through the networks of people who use drugs. So look out for them, encourage others and yourselves to apply. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So throughout the conference, we've had the incredible crew from Drug Reporter Foundation, Peter and Ishvan, filming, capturing our memories. And I'd like to invite them to cue the film for that, but I've had a few announcements come in over the course of the last hour. So I think just if I could pause and give you this news. So first of all, Footscray has been made a designated area. Footscray is an area of Melbourne, which means the police will be able to stop people and search them tonight without cause. So think, if you could let your community networks know, they'll be particularly vulnerable in Footscray. People should be a little bit cautious. Then secondly, also bad news. An execution notice was issued this afternoon to one of Singapore's death row prisoners. Execution usually occurs around 7 days from the notice. One of our media scholars and the plenary speaker from Monday, Kirsten Han, who is an outstanding advocate around abolition of the death penalty. You can follow her on Twitter at KIXES. If you could follow her call to action there, you can get more details. And like Ajahn called for this morning, we must be vocal against the death penalty. So please follow Kirsten and get the information you need there. Okay, so on to our Drug Reporter film.
We say, Wiminjika, Gabamala Mangil, Banabun Yalambu Warangeri Balaknir, and Amaga Gil Bill Nicholson. It's not just a broad welcome, it's welcoming you for a purpose. And the purpose I'm explaining now is as a gathering here to talk about the very important social issues and healing of people.
I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and note that sovereignty has never been ceded. We recognise that this land sings with 60,000 years of living culture and acknowledge that modern history is scarred by massacres, violent dispossession of land, and the trauma of the stolen generation. When we stop to acknowledge the violence of colonialism in Australia and name systemic racism as the source of the violence experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we take a small step towards creating a more equitable world. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
What's the situation in the country in general, in Australia?
Well, there's a lot of progress. Our capital has been the most progressive over the last 2 or 3 years. That involves legislation to decriminalise drug use, and that is going ahead this year. They've legalised cannabis, possession of cannabis. They've had pill testing programs at festivals. We've had medical cannabis in Australia for quite some time, which has worked quite well. We've had a supervised injecting room set up in 2018 in a suburb not far from here, where there was, high prevalence overdoses and a lot of public injecting, and that room has been outstanding in terms of its achievements. We've had a 50% reduction in overdose deaths in that area. We've had significant change in public injecting.
The injecting room, if they want access, they'll go through there, but they can just come in and access regular needle and syringe services or access the consulting side. We've had over 6,000 separate individuals register to use the service, and there's almost 400,000 visits to the service in that time. So we've had more than 6,000 overdoses. This is the injecting zone. So it's got the capacity for 20 people to inject simultaneously.
You get your syringe, a spoon, water, and a tourniquet.
95% of the visits to the room are to inject heroin, sometimes in combination with other things, and only about 3% methamphetamines.
I really like this room because I know I'll come out and I can safely use whatever my substance of choice is on the day. And this is like one of the few places where I feel welcomed and not judged and not ostracised for what I do. I just feel safe here. I know that I'm not going to die in the alleyway.
How would you feel about the service, the drugs actually being prescribed and supplied here rather than having to buy on the street corner?
That would make it the perfect service. That'd be a dream.
It's called a vein finder. It kind of can show up the veins more easily.
Well, I think this is probably our most informal area, and it's also the place we really get to build up relationship and rapport with people. We can actually do a lot of our referral work, our psychosocial work, and also engaging with people to check in on how they are.
So you can get a very quick, rapid result within 60 minutes for hepatitis C RNA, so indicating current hepatitis C infections. You can obviously get treatment prescribed very quickly, and then clients started on treatment very quickly as well.
You have a range of services from primary care, the hepatitis testing you've seen, opiate dependence treatment, oral health care in conjunction with oral health service, legal support, drug treatment, wound care, sexually transmitted infections, mental health support. There's a range of services that we provide in this space here.
To see the holistic range of services you have here, supporting the most vulnerable in the community is really heartwarming. And to think that it's all paid for by the public purse is particularly encouraging. And clearly there's a need for much more of it, not only in this city and state, but across Australia. My own country has nothing like this.
We have 1,000 people from 70 to 80 countries around the world. There's a huge amount of energy, and the research being presented is incredible. The activism we're hearing about, the personal stories, the peer leadership.
It's really good to run into people that I haven't seen for a number of years, and good to connect, especially after Melbourne's lockdowns. Gives us opportunity to rebuild and regain momentum that felt sorely lost.
In Japan, stigma against people who use drugs is deep-rooted. Almost all people report to police once they know a person uses drugs, even in hospitals, social welfare offices, schools, or shelters. So no one talks about their drug use when they need support, or they just give it up. So that's why I started Harm Reduction Tokyo. So we provide psychosocial support to survive. So through chat services, so you can talk freely and safely. And in the previous year, we chat more than 2,000 times and met over 200 people who use drugs. We will not stop doing this until the society changes.
What is the general harm reduction situation in China?
Well, 10 years ago, it was still pretty good, but more recently, especially after start of COVID, the Chinese services have deteriorated. Methadone program is still ongoing, but other services, harm reduction services, such as needle exchange, only provided as a lip service.
In Thailand, you know about drugs. It's illegal. Provide the needles. It's illegal too. Government not provide the needles for our drug users. Right now, just civil society provide. We need more funding and we need more organization to do for harm reduction too.
Often governments talk about, we take a health approach to drug use. We have drug rehab programs for people, but you need to look behind those kind of nice sounding words to see what the reality is. And often it's still, it is almost always very punitive still. The biggest thing that the government could do probably is just to leave people alone. And I think this is essentially the biggest challenge at the moment.
In the words of a great Australian, Michael Kirby, the state should stay out of the bedroom.
What are the special needs of women who use drugs in Kenya?
Many women who use drugs are homeless, and they're homeless together with their children. We have established low threshold shelters that are managed by women who use drugs at the community level. These shelters are near the drug using sites which can easily be accessible to the women.
Can you talk about the advocacy toolkit you developed with the network?
We can train using this toolkit harm reduction service providers so that when women who use drugs and gender diverse people who use drugs, when they come for harm reduction services, can they also access sexual and reproductive health services? And if they cannot access contraceptives, let's say they cannot even access safe abortion, they cannot access information on perinatal and newborn care in harm reduction services, where else would they access it?
A lot of us just are starting to realize how important mental health is and actually addressing it, not just for the people that we service or the people that we work with, but also for the actual workers themselves.
The overarching theme of the conference, of course, is strength and solidarity. For me as a trans person, I find this to be a really important message. The fact that I have multiple intersecting identities, both of which are marginalized as a person who uses drugs and as a trans woman, really highlights how we need to have solidarity across different social justice movements.
So if you would like to send a message to these professionals in their suits, what would it be?
You just sort of like stopped and cleared your mind of these myths, misconceptions that we all learn throughout our whole lives, because that's what's like bombarded to us about like who drug users are and what they're like. If you just try and put that aside, look at me as a person, listen to me and my experiences. Maybe you learn something and you learn that we're not scary, we're just fucking people like you and me. And like drug use is probably the least interesting thing about me, actually. Yeah.
What I really like at the conference this year is the attention for diversion of funds away from drug control towards health programs. That's something that I take home as a message, like, yeah, we really need to bring our game better to push for that agenda in the Netherlands.
Our final award for the evening is the International Rolliston Award. Now, we had an incredible array of nominations for this, but the absolutely outstanding one was the nomination for the Ukrainian activists, organizations and service providers maintaining and continuing services throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So please come up.
We are back to understanding of harm reduction as a comprehensive approach, which include evacuation of people from bombing shelters, providing shelters, providing food, and sleeping bags for kids and families. And that's all done by nurses, doctors, harm reduction activists under the bombing, under missile attacks.
What we're doing now from the Latin American network of people who use drugs is we're trying to push further to talk about stimulants, harm reduction, but mainly talk about human rights, to see if the international funders start working on reducing stigma and discrimination instead of only focusing on injecting drug use. That definitely it's important, but it's an issue that you mostly see in Colombia or Mexico.
What's really innovative from the international perspective is the Safer Supply program in Canada. Can you explain to people who don't know about what is it?
For the most part, it's very medicalized safe supply. So it is run through health clinics to engage people to get a prescribed supply of their substances. There is a program running in BC that is being run through a drug user group where they are purchasing substances, testing them, repackaging them, and giving them out to people that use substances in the community, but that's a very unique experience there.
You were speaking, I think, yesterday about decriminalization and how to do it in an adequate way. Can you explain that?
Yeah, decriminalization is a major intervention that we're pushing now, and part of it is recognizing that criminalization is an inappropriate response to drugs. One of the things that we fear in doing decriminalization is moving it from the criminal punishment system and then letting another system take over that space and continue to criminalize people, continue to stigmatize people, to continue to take up all the resources that are necessary to give to communities.
The things that I think will help turn the tide are solutions that have to happen way upstream.
How do you prevent someone from being traumatized in the first place? How do we eliminate poverty, right? How do we repair the harms caused by other structural violence like racism and white supremacy? Harm reduction, it helps a small portion of the folks who need these kinds of services who manage to find us, right? Harm reduction isn't in every corner of at least the US the way it should be. And even if it were, it still wouldn't be enough. There are too many people hurting and in pain. And I'm not suggesting that the only folks who use drugs are ones who are hurting and pain. I'm not suggesting that at all. But for those who are, help often doesn't come soon enough.
Do you think these conferences can make a change?
We are making changes now, and the ideas that we're bringing forward, what we're sharing, but the actions, right? Change is not just a word. It's an action. It's a place to be. It is how you eat, how you sleep, how you walk, how you wake up. And being here and taking time from being on the field and sharing and going back with truths and ideas and collaborations and talking about real things. How do you protest? How do you impact? How do you write laws? How do you cheat? How do you make things happen? This is important. That is change. So yes.
Thank you so much, Peter and Ishvan. Really exciting to see that, even though it just happened. But I think that's called narcissism. So delegates who attended HR23 have created a conference declaration specific to the Australian context. This declaration is intended to align our many voices so we might be more clearly heard when advocating for change. In creating this declaration, we've conducted an online poll and workshops aimed at identifying our collective priorities and developing simple yet powerful language to communicate them. We recognise that not all delegates will have been able to contribute, and therefore their voices and perspectives may not be represented. So there will be further opportunity to refine the priority statements that accompany the declaration. We see this declaration as the start of a conversation that we hope you will all continue. In addition, the HR23 Viral Hepatitis Pre-Conference developed statements calling for action for people who use drugs. One, that a global priority statement to integrate hepatitis B into harm reduction, and an Australian priority statement about hepatitis C and implementing needle and syringe programs in prisons. These will be circulated to delegates. So I'd like to invite Gabby, a proud Aboriginal woman and Harm Reduction Victoria board member, to tell us about the conference declaration.
Hello. So this is the Harm Reduction International 2023 Australian Conference Declaration. We recognise and celebrate the unique and valuable contribution that people who use drugs make to society. This declaration unites and aligns our many voices. We deserve and demand equitable health and social outcomes for people who use drugs. We recognise and we hold the shared priorities to ensure people who use drugs are permanently resourced to lead and self-determine through genuine inclusion and representation. Dismantle colonial systems and structures, end criminalisation and prohibition of drug use, end stigmatisation, discrimination and racism, ensure equitable access to an individual, so good, now I stuffed it. Ensure equitable access to an individual choice throughout the full range of health, harm reduction and related services. In advocating for these changes, we recognise the need to ensure the genuine equitable health and human rights for people who use drugs as determined by people who use drugs. Be community-led and driven by diverse voices, knowledge and experience of people who use drugs, including Indigenous peoples, young people, women, people of colour, people in custodial settings, queer and other marginalised groups. ensure Indigenous peoples and groups lead the work of decolonisation, including the International Indigenous Drug Policy Alliance and the Black Harm Reduction Network. Our priorities are detailed in an accompanying list of advocacy statements. We commit to continuing to refine our language and understanding when using these statements so that we may be united in advocating for community-led change through our many efforts. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, in order to wrap up, I'm going to ask the HRI team to join me on stage, against their will, and start by telling you a little bit about what it's been like to partner with Harm Reduction Victoria. I cannot thank the team enough for their endless support, day in, day out, their thoughtful conference planning, their partnership, all very much under the leadership of Sione Crawford, who is everything we would like to see as a leader in the harm reduction community. Somebody who makes space for others, somebody who listens before they speak, somebody who has such humility, he won't give me a long bio for him, but you get the gist. I'd like to shout out to Harm Reduction Victoria, Sione, Ben, Nick, Sam, Jane, and the team. Thank you so much for being an incredible conference partner. As I mentioned in the opening, we're really excited to also partner with AVIL, Asham, and Inshu in implementing this conference. So a big shout out to the new AVIL CEO, John Gobai, Charlie, Jeff, Elle, and the whole team, Nikita, Emma, Jason, and the team at Inshu, and Nadine, Shelley, Brett, and the team at Asham. So I'll take you through a few now. Local support committee members, including Craig Holloway and Gabby Brunning. The program committees, people from all over the world that dedicated their time to do such an amazing job of help us pull the incredible program together in a really democratic way. The organisations hosting the site visits, the Melbourne Convention Bureau team, Carolyn Vizot and her team, Shana, John Boy, and the team at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre have really been so supportive throughout the whole week. Our donors, sponsors, and exhibitors that have enabled us to issue 60 scholarships to get people here from around the world. A big shout out, and get your enthusiasm on for this one, to our volunteers. Please stand up. Can't believe none of you are wearing those orange t-shirts anymore. Thank you to Lee Hertel for leading the medical services with support from Harm Reduction Victoria and CoHealth. It's really important to us that we can talk about drug use and keep each other safe during the conference. Michael Kessler, our media consultant who literally worked around the clock for the past week, and Suchitra Rajagopalan, our communications strategist, and all the incredible work they've done to showcase this conference. We've had great media coverage across Southeast Asia and Australia, so thank you so much to both of them. Connor Ashley and Nigel Brunsden, our photographers, the most charming version of paparazzi. Eric, Thomas, Milena, and Helena, who do our website and design. The Elton John AIDS Foundation for supporting the film festival, and the team from Drug Reporter. Joao Sarmento from Crowdcoms, who went above and beyond. Joan and the team at Harry the Hirer for the beautiful exhibition space. Mickley and Mon, who ran the virtual element of the conference. Watch out for all the videos on YouTube in the coming weeks. Our fantastic founder, Patrick O'Hare, and our board member, Alex Stevens. Get a little closer for the last bit of love. Thank you so much to Ruud Ariete and Ailish Brennan for really stepping up and joining our conference team to make it work. And finally, Maddie O'Hare, Lucy O'Hare, our conference directors extraordinaire, who really have the vision for creating a conference that has the values that, you know, speak to our heart and mean that we can bring the community together in this way. So thank you so much to everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.